Okay, so Grenadiers, we encountered them last episode when we got into a bar fight. Grenadiers were originally the soldiers in charge of throwing grenades, hence the name. They were chosen for being tall, muscular, and fearless. Not only did they need the strength to throw grenades far enough to actually injure the enemy, they had to be brave or stupid enough to stay in the front lines of the battle to do it. Grenadiers were also called upon to be fast, effective assault troops, helping with things like storming breaches during sieges. You know, all the standard easy jobs that are likely to get you killed. By the mid 18th century, grenades had fallen out of favor, but grenadiers was still regarded as elite regiments called on to guard the right flank of their battalions, and still to do all the other dangerous work they'd gotten a reputation for. An interesting note on their hats: they were made high and narrow so that as not to get in the way while you were throwing grenades, which is a good feature to have. Eventually, the mitre hat became part of the standard dress uniform in numerous armies. It's also possible grenadiers were just really dig the idea of looking like the Pope. History's mute at that point. Braddock Expedition. This battle was part of the French-Indian War. In it, Edward Braddock forced... Oh my goodness. Braddock Expedition. This battle was part of the French and Indian War. In it, Edward Braddock's force of 1,500 British regulars and militia was decimated by a group of French-led troops half its size. This is not something we talk about much in Britain. Braddock had been sent to capture Fort Duquesne at the top of the Ohio River. His officers included a young George Washington, possibly because Washington knew the area, having surrendered at Fort Necessity the year before. Braddock's troops were about 10 miles from Fort Duquesne. Now I'm going to call it Duquesne from now on. Fort Duquesne, when they were ambushed by a group of French and indigenous fighters. Braddock's advanced troops were overwhelmed and fell back into the main body of the army. His rearguard didn't hear the order to stop and kept advancing into the main body of the army. The result was chaos. Almost every one of his soldiers was killed, with the exception of Washington. Braddock himself was fatally wounded. Washington had him carried from the field, and he died 4 days later. An interesting historical note: Braddock gave his officer's sash to Washington, asking him to preserve it. Washington did. It's still on display in Mount Vernon. The battle is also known as Braddock's defeat, but interestingly, no one knows why. I'm kidding, though if you need me to tell you why, I don't think you're really cut out for this. So, Abenaki. The Abenaki nation originated in what's now northern New England and the southern Canadian Maritimes, although suggesting they're only one nation may be a bit of misnomer, since Abenaki can refer to numerous groups from same approximate geographic area and language family. Algonquin, since you asked. Although various Abenaki would join together during crisis events, like when they were under attack from other nations, for the most part they had no central authority. That's probably partly what caused the encroachment of British colonists on their land. The British liked to have formal governments they could negotiate treaties with. It's just so much more civilized, and sometimes there are canapes. So from the colonist's perspective, no central government meant Abenaki had no claim on land. Of course, they could have found out otherwise, but that would have taken work and been complicated. Perhaps most importantly, the Abenaki might have said no. While the Abenaki tried to remain neutral during French and Indian War, they were quite literally caught between the warring British and French colony, so some conflict was inevitable. For the most part, they sided with the French, who were less responsible for driving them out of their homeland. The lesser of two evils, I suppose you could say, though that's a sentence I never thought I'd say about the French. Lenape, also called the Lenni Lenape, or the Delaware. Before European colonization, the Lenape lived mostly along the banks of the Delaware River in what's modern-day New Jersey and Pennsylvania. The Lenape were one of the first nations to come into contact with Europeans, most significantly with William Penn, who founded Pennsylvania, which was a stroke of luck given his name. While the Lenape relationship with Penn was mostly peaceful, when Penn died, his sons forced most of the Lenape off their land in a deal known as the Walking Purchase. During the French and Indian War, the Lenape sided primarily with the French, though some individual groups would later leave to join the British. In 1778, they were the first to sign a land treaty with the Continental Congress, agreeing to provide scouts to the army in exchange for supplies. I imagine they simply liked fine cheeses and onion. The newly formed United States shown its gratitude by eventually moving the Lenape into isolated communities in Ohio and southern Canada. How wonderfully thoughtful. Shawnee. At the time of the French and Indian War, the people of the Shawnee Nation were mostly living in and around the Ohio Valley, the territory surrounding Fort Duquesne. Traditionally, their hunting grounds had extended into Pennsylvania and Virginia, but they were being slowly moved from their island by the advancing line of British colonization, hoping to stop, or at least slow, settlement. Some of the Shawnee entered the war siding with traditional trading partners, that is, the French. By 1758, some Shawnee negotiated peace with the British in the Treaty of Eston. I can't do voices anymore. However, the treaty wasn't respected, and if you know anything about colonial history, you're probably sadly unsurprised by that, leading to another war, Pontiac's Rebellion, in 1763. By the time the American Revolution started, many of the Shawnee opted to remain neutral, although some sided with the British, again hoping to help push back the colonists. Unfortunately, the result was the same as many other indigenous peoples. The Shawnee were forced to leave their land, with a majority eventually settling in Oklahoma. Good Lord, settling in Oklahoma, as if their story couldn't get any worse. No kidding.